Liora Fenwick always knew the river by its smallest habits. Before dawn, when the valley still wore night like a shawl, the millstream spoke in thin silver syllables against the sluice boards. It tasted of cold stone and far snowmelt, even in late summer, and it carried the day's work on its back: reeds for thatch, drowned twigs for kindling, sometimes the bright flash of a trout that had strayed too near the wheel race. She rose to those sounds the way other people rose to bells. The mill house was a lean, weather-darkened building set tight to the river's bend. Its timbers held the smell of grain dust and wet wood, its beams had been patched so many times they looked stitched. Liora's father, Edda, said the place had a heart, the great wheel outside, its paddles taking the river's push and turning it into flour and bread and winter steadiness. If the wheel stopped, everything stopped. The baker's ovens. The market's loaves. The valley's rhythm. Liora pulled on her woolen shawl, tied her hair back with twine, and stepped into the damp morning. Mist lay over the water in a low, patient layer, softening the edge of the bank. The wheel creaked once as the current nudged it, then fell quiet. A normal creak. A normal quiet. She carried a net over one shoulder and a wicker basket in the crook of her arm. It was not a fisherman's fine net, but a catch net, knotted with thick cord and mended so often the knots looked like rough beads. Liora used it to gather what the river offered: driftwood and lost tools, reed bundles that had broken from upstream, anything useful. In lean weeks, she brought in fish too, though Edda teased that she was more likely to snag a boot than a trout. Morning, she murmured, because it felt wrong to come to the river and say nothing at all. The water answered in its usual language, a hush along the stones, a slip under the wheel, a faint slap where the current met the first plank of the sluice. Liora knelt and set her fingers into the edge, letting the cold bite her skin. The river was awake. The river was moving. The river was itself. She rose, waded along the shallows where the bank dipped, and cast her net into a slow eddy near the roots of a willow. The cord tightened, dragged a little. She drew it in and shook free a small haul of reeds and twigs. Nothing worth keeping. She tossed the tangles into the basket anyway. A fire did not care if its fuel was elegant. She cast again, further out. That was when the net caught. At first, she thought she'd snagged something heavy and stupid: an iron hook, a fallen length of chain from some upstream cart, perhaps even one of the river stones that had loosened in last week's storms. The cord pulled hard against her palm. The mesh went rigid as if it had bitten into a shape with corners. Liora braced her boots on the slick rock and hauled. The water bulged around the net as though reluctant to release what it held. For a breath, her arms strained and her shoulders burned. Then the river gave, and the net came up with a weight that made her knees buckle. It was not a stone. It was not a chain. It was a crown. It surfaced slick and shining, water sheeting off it in smooth ribbons. Not gold, exactly, more like metal that had learned the color of moonlit riverbed, pale and dimly luminous, with a sheen that shifted when she tilted it. The crown's band was braided with what looked like reeds, but the reeds did not wilt or tear, they curved as if alive, pale as bone and soft as kelp. Between them were set small river pearls, each one imperfect and beautiful, like captured drops. Liora stared until the muscles in her arms trembled. A foolish thought skittered through her mind: someone's masquerade treasure, lost in a drunken dare. A noble's river gift thrown away. Then the river went quiet. Not the normal quiet of morning mist. Not the hush of a slow current. Quiet like a held breath. The eddy stilled. The surface flattened. The faint slaps and murmurs faded until there was no sound at all from the water, only the distant cry of a bird and the soft creak of her own leather straps. Liora's skin prickled. She looked up at the wheel. The paddles rested. No flow pushed them. The wheel, which should have been turning with the river's patient insistence, sat as still as if it had been carved. No, she whispered, and the word felt swallowed by the air. She plunged her hand into the water again, deeper, urgent, as if she could physically stir it back into motion. The cold bit hard. But the river did not slide around her wrist. It did not tug. It did not dance. It simply Saturday. Like water poured into a basin and left. Her breath came sharp. She held the crown with both hands and felt, suddenly, that it was heavier than metal should be. Not just in weight, though it was heavy enough, but in meaning, in presence. It pressed against her thoughts. It made the morning seem to lean toward it. She tried to lower it back to the river. The moment the crown's edge neared the surface, the water shivered not with movement, but with refusal. The surface tightened, a skin drawn taut, and the crown would not sink. It hovered against the river as if repelled by something unseen. Liora drew it back with a startled gasp, and the river's surface went smooth again. Still. Waiting. Her mouth went dry. The valley depended on this flow. The mill depended on it. Edda depended on it. Everyone's bread and winter stores and daily steadiness depended on the river doing what it had always done, move. Liora looked around as if someone might be watching her mistake. But the bank was empty. The mist curled among the willows. Her basket sat with its handful of wet debris, as innocent as ever. The crown in her hands gleamed with a quiet, wrong light. She should run. She should take it to the village elder, or the priest, or, she didn't know. Someone who had words for impossible things. Someone who knew the old songs people hummed under their breath when storms came too hard. Instead, her feet carried her back to the millhouse on instinct. Inside, the air was warmer, thick with grain dust and the faint sour-sweet smell of fermenting mash. Edda was already awake, his sleeves rolled, his hair still mussed from sleep. He stood by the grinding stones with his hands on his hips, frowning toward the window. It stopped, he said, before she could speak. His voice was calm, but she saw the tightness around his eyes. I felt it in the floor. Liora lifted the crown. For a moment, her father simply stared. Then his face changed in a slow, careful way, like a man deciding whether he was seeing a ghost. Where, he asked, very softly, did you get that? In the net, she said. Her tongue felt thick. It was tangled. Like driftwood. And then, she swallowed. The river went still. Edda stepped closer. He did not touch the crown. He hovered his hands over it as if heat might rise from it. That's not any lord's trinket, he murmured. Not any bridal circlet or festival finery. That's. He stopped. His gaze went to the window again, as if he expected the river itself to be standing outside. Liora's fingers tightened around the band. The reeds braided into it were cool and smooth, yet they seemed to resist the pressure of her grip, springing back like living things. What is it? She demanded, sharper than she meant. Fear made her voice brittle. What did I pull out of our river? Edda exhaled. Old folks call it the river crown, he said. They say the river has a king, and that he wears the crown the way a mountain wears snow. Not for ornament. For order. A king, Liora repeated, and tried not to laugh because the alternative was to shake apart. Edda, don't. The floorboard beneath their feet gave a faint, hollow creak. Not from the mill's bones. From something deeper. Like the building itself had heard. Edda's hand moved, half raising as if to hush her. He looked at Liora with a steadiness he saved for hard winters. Liora, he said, go back to the bank. Now. Take that with you. If this is what I think it is, we don't leave it lying on the table like a loaf pan. And you? She asked. I'll bar the flour bins, he said, though that made no sense, not really. His gaze flicked again. I'll stand where I can see. Liora's heart thudded. She did not argue. She tucked the crown into her shawl as carefully as if it might bite, then hurried outside. The riverbank looked wrong in full daylight. The mist was thinning, revealing the water's surface. It should have been broken by current, by shifting reflections, by small traveling ripples. Instead it lay flat and perfect, reflecting the pale sky so cleanly that it was hard to tell where air ended and water began. The wheel remained still. Birds gathered on the fence posts and tilted their heads as if confused by the lack of sound. Liora walked down to the edge and stopped, because something in her wanted to kneel and beg the river to forgive her. She held the crown out, not quite touching the water this time. If you're angry, she whispered, feeling foolish and desperate all at once, I didn't mean I didn't know. I only. The river did not answer in any way she recognized. Then the water near the sluice gate darkened. At first it was only a shadow, like a passing cloud. But the sky above was clear. The darkness gathered, thickened, and then rose upward, swelling into a shape. A man stepped out of the river without disturbing the surface. He was tall, though his height was difficult to judge because his presence altered the space around him, as if the air made room. Water streamed from his shoulders and sleeves, but it did not drip. It clung in thin veils that slid and reformed, like silk caught in a slow breeze. His hair was black as silt and moved as though submerged even in open air. His skin held the faint sheen of wet stone. And his eyes. His eyes were river deep, reflecting nothing unless he chose. When his gaze met Liara's, she felt as if she'd been seen from the inside out, every thought turned face up like pebbles in a clear pool. Liara's knees went weak. She did not fall only because fear locked her joints. He looked at the crown in her hands. A muscle in his jaw tightened. The river behind him remained still, but the air felt charged, like the moment before lightning decides. "Give it," he said. His voice was not loud, yet it seemed to reverberate through the millhouse beams and the stones under her feet. It tasted of cold current and deep places that did not see sunlight. Liara's fingers clenched harder. "Are you?" Her throat closed. She forced the word out. "Are you the River King?" His gaze did not flinch. "I am what your valley's water has called sovereign since the first spring cut its path through this land." He took a step forward. The surface of the river did not ripple. "That crown is mine." Liora swallowed. "It was in my net," she said, as if that explained everything. "I didn't steal it." "You took it from the river," he replied, and there was no accusation in the words, only the shape of a fact. "And the river has stopped because it cannot be seated without its regalia." Liora stared at the motionless water, at the silent wheel, at the stillness that felt like pressure in her ears. "So if I give it back," she said, "it will flow again." For the first time, his expression shifted so slightly that she almost missed it. Something like restraint. Something like warning. "If you return it wrongly," he said, "you will finish what was begun." Lyra's skin went colder than the river had been. What was begun? He did not answer at once. He looked past her, toward the valley, where the line of fields waited green and trusting. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but no less heavy. "Someone bound my river," he said. "With a vow spoken under crown. Without it, I cannot unmake the binding. With it, if placed without care, the binding tightens until the valley dries to bone." Lyra's breath shuddered out. "I don't understand." "You are not meant to," he said. Then, as if the words cost him, he added, "Yet you are involved now." The crown seemed to pulse against her palms, not with heat, but with a subtle insistence and awareness of being spoken about. Liora lifted her chin, because if she lowered it she might start to shake. "What do you want from me?" His gaze returned to her, and the force of it made her chest ache. "The crown must be returned where it was forged into law," he said. "In the courts beneath the water. Where vows are weighed and truth cannot be hidden." Courts. Beneath water. Lyra's mind tried to reject the images: marble halls drowned in current, judges with kelp hair, voices trapped in bubbles. It sounded like a fever dream children told each other to scare themselves. But the river was still. The wheel was silent. Her father's livelihood and the valley's survival were held in this impossible moment. "I can't breathe underwater," she said, grasping for something practical. "You will," he replied. His eyes flicked to the base of her throat as if he could already see the shape of what would be placed there. "If the Pearl Court grants it." Lyra's grip tightened on the crown. "And if I refuse?" The River King's face did not change, but the still water behind him seemed to grow heavier, as if the river itself leaned into the question. "Then the valley dries," he said simply. "And the river remains held. And you will live with what you lifted from the current." Her stomach turned. Anger flared, not because she did not believe him, but because his certainty left no space for her fear. "I didn't ask for this," she whispered. "No," he said, and there was something almost regret in the word. "Neither did I." He extended his hand, palm up. His fingers were long, the nails pale as shell. Water threaded between them in thin, shifting lines. "Give it," he said again, quieter. "Now. I will carry it below. I will restore what I can while we travel." Lyra stared at his hand. If she placed the crown there, would she lose her chance to make sense of any of this? Would she be left on a drying bank with only a story no one would believe? If she held it, the river stayed still. Her heartbeat thudded hard in her ears. How do I know you won't simply disappear with it? She asked, voice trembling despite her effort. How do I know you won't leave us, leave the valley, to suffer? His eyes narrowed slightly. Because I am the river, he said, as if she had asked how she knew dawn would follow night. Then his gaze sharpened, and the air seemed to tighten around her, not threatening, but absolute. And because you cannot return it safely without me. Liora drew in a breath that tasted dry already. You want me to come with you, she said, understanding landing like a stone in her gut. I require it, he said. A mortal witness. A mortal voice. A willing step. Willing. The word made her throat ache. She looked at the crown again, at the braided reeds and pale pearls, and felt the faint tug of it like the river's gravity had shifted, aligning itself with her choice. Behind her, the millhouse door opened. Edda stood on the threshold, his face pale, his hands clenched at his sides. He had seen. Of course he had seen. Liora wanted to run to him, to hide the crown under the flour sacks and pretend nothing had changed. Instead, she lifted her chin toward the River King. If I go, she said, each word careful, you swear the valley won't die while I'm gone. The River King's gaze held hers. I cannot swear what has been bound away from me, he said, and Lyra's hope twisted painfully until he continued. But I will hold what thread of flow I can, at cost to myself, until the crown is seated again. Your mill will turn enough to live. Your wells will not empty completely. And in exchange, Liora said, I walk into a world that wasn't meant for me. Yes, he replied. Edda took a step forward. Liora, he said hoarsely, the word half warning, half plea. She looked back at her father. In his eyes, she saw the valley, the people who bought flour by the scoop, the orchard keepers' worn hands, the children who ran along the banks in spring. She looked down at the still river. Then she faced the River King again. All right, she said, because there was no other word that fit between terror and duty. I will come. For the first time, something in the River King's posture eased, like a lock turning. Not softness. Not yet. But a shift from force to acknowledgement. Then we begin, he said. Liora placed the crown into his outstretched hand. The instant metal met his skin, the river shuddered. Not into full flow, nothing that easy. But a thin, trembling current returned, as if the water remembered, in a cautious whisper, how to move. The mill wheel outside creaked and turned a fraction. A sound like relief moved through the stones. Lyra's breath caught. The River King, Sablevein, the old songs had named him, closed his fingers around the crown. Water rose along his wrist like a living sleeve. He looked at Lyra's throat again, and this time she felt it, an impending mark, a token of breath, a tether into the river's law. You will need the pearl court, he said. And you will need to understand this. Beneath the water, you cannot hide from truth. Liora swallowed, her pulse loud. I don't hide, she lied automatically. The River King's gaze sharpened, and for the briefest moment she felt a strange pressure in her chest, as if the air itself did not like her answer. His mouth did not curve, but something in his eyes suggested he had noticed. We will see, he said. Then he turned toward the river, and the still surface opened for him as if it were a door. He looked back once. Come, he said. Before the thread of flow breaks. Liora hesitated only long enough to meet her father's gaze again. Edda's eyes shone, but his voice held steady. Bring our river home, he said, as if it were a blessing. Liora nodded. She stepped to the edge, the air tasting dry and wrong, and reached for the River King's offered hand. His fingers closed around hers, cold, firm, unmistakably real. The river, still half-held, accepted her weight. And Liora Fenwick, Miller's daughter, stepped into the water as if stepping into a vow. The river did not feel like drowning. That was the first shock, greater even than the cold that slid over Lyra's boots and swallowed the hem of her skirt. She expected panic, a desperate clawing need for air the moment the surface closed above her head. Instead, as soon as the water covered her mouth, the world changed its rules with a quiet finality. A cool pressure settled at the base of her throat, as though an unseen hand had placed a smooth pebble there. It pulsed once, gentle, steady, and suddenly her lungs drew in not air, but water that did not burn. It tasted faintly of stone and mint, and it filled her chest with a clean, startling ease. She gasped out of reflex, and bubbles fled her lips like startled birds. Sablevein's hand tightened around hers. He did not look back at the surface. He guided her downward as if this was the most natural path in the world. Above them, the river was a ceiling of silver. Below, it opened into a depth she had never imagined could exist beneath the millstream's familiar curve. The light dimmed to a blue-green hush. Sounds stretched and softened. Her own heartbeat became a drum in her ears. Liora's fingers clamped around his, not because she wanted to cling, but because she needed an anchor. The river tugged at her skirts, pressed at her skin, combed through her hair. Yet she did not float helplessly. The pressure at her throat seemed to settle her in the water, keeping her body where it ought to be. She tried to speak an instinctive question, a curse, anything, and her words came out as a chain of bubbles that rose past her face, each bubble holding the shape of a sound. They drifted upward, wobbling slightly, and then, impossibly, they did not pop. They hovered for a heartbeat, as though listening, and then slid away along the current. Sablevein glanced at them and then at her. His eyes, dark, bottomless, held something she could not name. "Your breath token has taken," he said. This time, she heard him clearly, as if his voice traveled through the water straight into her bones. No bubbles. No distortion. Just sound where sound had no right to be. "I didn't see you put anything on me," Liora said, the words coming out of her mouth as normal words, though the water pressed against her lips when she spoke. "It was placed when you agreed," he replied. Liora's stomach dropped. "You marked me without telling me." "I warned you," he said, and there was no heat in his tone, only the bluntness of law. "You cannot walk below without being known to the river." She lifted her free hand to the base of her throat. Beneath her fingers, the skin was smooth, yet she could feel a faint raised shape, like an embossed seal pressed into wax. It was cold and strangely alive, as if it responded to her touch with a soft pulse. "What does it do besides let me breathe?" she demanded. Sablevein's gaze flicked ahead, where the river darkened into a corridor of stone. "It binds you to court law," he said. "It keeps you from being crushed by depth. It allows you to speak in the courts." Then, after a pause so brief it might have been the river's own hesitation, he added, "And it will not allow you to lie when truth is demanded." Liora's pulse stumbled. "That's not your right." "It is the river's," he answered, and her anger met something solid and immovable. She wanted to argue more. She wanted to demand terms and limits and apologies. But the river around them was no longer the millstream she knew. It was becoming something structured, shaped. Stone rose on either side like walls, slick and dark. Pale luminescent moss clung to cracks, casting faint light. The water pressed through narrow passages carved smooth by time and intention. "Where are we going?" she asked, because if she could name the path, perhaps she could keep herself steady. "To the first gate," Sablevein said. "The Reed Chancellery keeps it." Liora's mind latched onto the familiar parts of the words. Gate. Chancellery. As if bureaucracy could exist in a river. As if there were ledgers kept in water. Sablevein drew her through the stone corridor. The current here was slow, deliberate. It felt guided, as if the river had rules even in how it moved. Ahead, the passage widened into an open chamber. The floor was sand packed hard as clay. The ceiling arched above, and embedded in the stone were countless reeds, thousands of them, each one pale and upright, like a field frozen midsway. They were not growing. They were placed. Each reed was etched with tiny marks that looked like writing, though the symbols shifted when Liora tried to focus. At the far end of the chamber stood a gate made of woven rivergrass and old driftwood, bound together with silver thread that glittered like fish scale. It blocked the next corridor completely. Beside the gate floated a figure. She was not quite human, not quite fish. Her body was long and lean, her skin the color of damp parchment, her hair a sheet of green-black reeds that moved as if stirred by wind rather than water. Her eyes were sharp and pale, like river stones that had never warmed in sun. When she spoke, her words did not bubble. They arrived in Lyra's head clean and exact. Sablevein, the figure said, and the name sounded like a seal breaking. You come under thin flow. Sablevein inclined his head a fraction. Warden Relune. Lyra's breath caught. Warden. That meant authority. That meant rules. Relune's pale gaze slid to Lyra. It did not feel like being looked at. It felt like being measured. And you bring a mortal, Relune said. Named. Lyra opened her mouth, then hesitated. She did not like that word. Named. As if the courts could own her by knowing what to call her. Sablevein's fingers pressed lightly against her hand, a quiet warning, or perhaps a reminder of the bargain she had made. Liora Fenwick, she said, forcing the words out with steadiness. A small bubble rose from her lips as she spoke her name. It glimmered faintly, and instead of drifting away, it floated between her and Relune like a bead. Relune watched it. The bubble rose a little higher, steady and clear. Truth spoken, Relune said. The token holds. Lyra's throat tightened, not from water, but from the sudden awareness that the river itself had just judged her. Relune drifted closer. She did not touch Lyra, but the water around her seemed colder, as if she carried deep currents with her. You hold the crown's return in your wake, Relune said, addressing Sablevein. Yet the crown is not on your brow. It cannot be, Sablevein replied. Not until it is seated by right at the throne rail. Relune's gaze sharpened. Then it is worse than I feared. Lyra's courage, thin and stubborn, pushed forward. What do you mean? She asked. Relune's eyes flicked to her again. It means, she said, that someone used the crown as a lever and then let it drift. It means contracts were spoken that should never have been allowed to form. Her tone was flat, but there was something like disgust beneath it. And it means the river above is choking while we debate at gates. Sablevein's jaw tightened. Open the way. Relune did not move. Procedure, she said, and the word felt like a stone dropped in water. You come with a mortal witness. You come with a bargain. The Chancellery must record the terms. Lyra's stomach clenched. Record them. Relune lifted one long finger and tapped a reed embedded in the wall. The reed glowed. A thin strand of light unfurled from it like ink poured into water, forming a line that hovered in the chamber. Speak your bargain, Relune said. As sworn. Sablevein turned his gaze to Lyra. For a moment, the water between them seemed to still. In his eyes, she saw something like reluctance. He had not told her everything. She felt that sharply now. But the valley needed flow. The mill needed turning. Her father needed his daughter to come back with the river breathing again. Lyra squared her shoulders in water that wanted to press her down. We agreed, she said, that I would accompany him to return the crown safely through the courts below. In exchange, he would hold a thread of flow to keep the valley alive while we travel. As she spoke, her words turned into bubbles that rose slowly, one after another, and then hovered in front of the glowing reed line. Each bubble touched the line and vanished, absorbed like ink. The reed's light brightened. Relune watched, expression unreadable. And the cost? She asked. Lyra's mouth went dry. Cost? Sablevein's gaze did not leave Lyra's face. There is always a cost, he said quietly. Lyra's pulse hammered. She had not agreed to a cost. Not explicitly. But Sablevein had said he would hold the flow at cost to himself. She forced herself to speak it. He will spend his strength maintaining that thread, she said. His form will weaken. His authority will fray until the crown is seated again. More bubbles rose, each one shining, and each one sank instead of rising, heavy, dragging downward. Lyra froze. The water at her throat tightened. The token pulsed, not gentle now, but sharp as a pinprick. She had not lied. Had she? Relune's gaze flicked to the bubbles sinking. There is more, she said. Lyra's lungs drew in water that suddenly tasted bitter. Her mind raced back over the bargain, every word, every pause. She remembered Sablevein saying he required a mortal witness, a mortal voice, a willing step. She remembered the way the crown had tugged at her thoughts. She remembered his eyes when he said she was involved now. The truth she had not wanted to name surfaced like a corpse from deep water. Lyra's voice faltered. Bubbles clung to her lips, heavy. I will be bound to court law until the rite is complete, she forced out. I will not be free to leave. The bubbles rose this time, clear and light, and dissolved into the reed line. The bitterness in her mouth eased. Relune nodded once, as if that was what she had been waiting for. And when the rite is complete? Relune asked. Lyra looked at Sablevein. He did not answer for her. He simply held her gaze, waiting. The token at her throat pulsed again, like a heartbeat outside her body. I don't know, she admitted, and the bubble that carried the words rose pure and bright, as if ignorance could be truer than comfort. Relune's mouth tightened. Ignorance is permitted, she said. Deceit is not. With a flick of her hand, the woven gate shuddered. The silver thread binding it loosened, uncoiling like a fish slipping free. The rivergrass parted, opening a gap wide enough for them to pass. Sablevein guided Lyra through. Beyond the gate, the corridor shifted. The stone became smoother, the light dimmer. The water tasted older, less like surface streams and more like the deep places under mountains. Lyra's mind spun. The courts were real. The laws were real. Her throat token was real, pressing against her every time she tried to soften truth into something easier. She caught Sablevein's sleeve, tugging him to a stop in a small alcove where the current was gentler. You should have told me, she said, the words clipped. Sablevein turned. The water around him seemed to fold closer, as if the river listened to him. About the token binding me, she clarified, though he knew. About the cost. About the fact that you can't promise me I will be able to come back. His eyes did not flicker. If I had told you everything, he said, you might have refused. And you needed me to say yes, Lyra snapped. I needed the river to breathe, he corrected. And you held the crown when the river stopped. That makes you a hinge in this matter whether you desire it or not. Lyra's chest tightened. So I am a tool. Something shifted in Sablevein's expression, so subtle, it might have been the play of light. But she felt it anyway, like current turning. No, he said. A tool cannot choose. Lyra's throat pulsed sharply, as if the token itself approved that statement. She hated that it had. Sablevein's hand rose, not quite touching her face, hovering near the token. It is not a brand of ownership, he said, quieter. It is a protection. Without it, the pressure would crush you. The cold would stop your heart. The courts would not even hear your voice. And with it, Lyra said, I can't lie. His gaze held hers. Truth is the only currency that does not rot in water, he said. Lyra wanted to fling something at him. She wanted to scream. But the river pressed around her, heavy with rules, and she was suddenly aware of how easily panic could make her lose breath even with the token's aid. She forced her hands to unclench. Where are we going next? She asked, because practicality was the only rope she could cling to. The Silt elders, Sablevein said. They remember what was sworn. And after that? Lyra demanded. The Pearl Court, he replied. To secure your token properly and to challenge the oathbroker who twisted the crown's law. Lyra's stomach turned. You know who did it. Sablevein's jaw tightened. I suspect, he corrected. Suspicion is not enough to condemn in the courts. Lyra stared at him. The River King, sovereign of the valley's lifeblood, forced to gather evidence like a petitioner. The thought made him seem less like a storm given shape, and more like something that could be harmed. As if sensing her gaze, Sablevein's eyes softened by a fraction. I do not ask you to trust me yet, he said. Only to walk. Lyra's throat pulsed again. Gentle this time. Like the river urging patience. She did not answer yes. She did not answer no. She simply let him take her hand again, because the corridor ahead was darker, and the thought of walking it alone made her heart feel too small for her chest. They moved deeper. The river around them changed as they traveled. Sometimes it narrowed into channels lined with stones that hummed faintly when Sablevein passed. Sometimes it opened into submerged caverns where pale fish with translucent fins drifted like ghosts. Once, they crossed a wide hall whose floor was tiled in smooth black pebbles, each pebble etched with a single word. Lyra could not read them, but she felt their meaning brushing at her thoughts, promise, debt, pardon, spill, share. At one point, the water grew thin and sharp, and Liora realized with a jolt that they were rising. The pressure eased. Light brightened. They emerged into air inside a cavern whose ceiling was a low dome of stone. A waterfall spilled from a crack high above, feeding a dark pool at the center. The air smelled of wet earth and lichen. Tiny white insects hovered like drifting ash. Liora staggered, lungs drawing air again, and nearly collapsed until Sablevein's hand steadied her elbow. His touch was cold through her sleeve, but firm. She jerked away instinctively, then regretted it immediately, because he swayed. Just slightly. Like a man who had stood too fast after fever. Liora began. I am holding the thread, he said, and his voice sounded thinner here, in air. Less like river through stone. More like wind. The guilt that rose in Liora's chest was swift and unwanted. She had not asked him to spend himself. Yet she had. By agreeing. By needing. She pressed her lips together. Then sit, she ordered, as if she could command a spirit sovereign. Before you fall. Sablevein's eyes flicked to her, and for a heartbeat she thought he might refuse out of pride or law. Instead, he lowered himself to a stone ledge near the pool. Liora swallowed her fear and stepped closer. She pulled her shawl tighter, then hesitated, feeling foolish. The cavern air was cold. But he looked colder. She reached out and, with careful reluctance, laid the edge of her shawl over his shoulders. His body went very still. The river around him, she could feel it even here, faint as a distant song, seemed to pause. I'm not doing it to bind you, she muttered, cheeks hot despite the chill. It's just cloth. Sablevein's gaze lifted to hers. In the dim cavern, his eyes reflected the falling water like slivers of moon. Cloth can be kinder than vows, he said quietly. Liora's throat tightened. She looked away, focusing on the pool instead, on the ripple where the waterfall struck. How long until the valley, she started, then stopped, afraid of the answer. Sablevein's voice came low. The thread will hold for days if unchallenged, he said. But Merowan has influence. And the mortal who siphons the river is relentless. Liora's hands curled into fists. Joran Vask, she said, the name tasting like grit. She did not know how she knew it would be him, but she did. Everyone did, in their bones, when trouble came that smelled like greed. Sablevein's gaze sharpened. You know him. His upstream, Liora said. His always wanted more water. Always talked about improving the valley like we're a field to be harvested. She swallowed. If he's part of this. He is a hand, Sablevein said. Not the mind. The binding was spoken below. Liora looked back at him. Merowan. Sablevein did not confirm. He did not deny. But his silence was loud. Liora sat on a stone opposite him, hugging her knees. The crown was not in her hands anymore, yet she could still feel its weight like an absence. She tried to steady herself with anger. It was easier than fear. You said the courts won't accept suspicion, she said. So what do we do? Sablevein's gaze drifted to the pool. The waterfall's sound filled the cavern, a constant, soothing roar. We gather truth, he said. We speak it where it cannot be twisted. And if the courts are corrupt? Liora asked. Then we appeal to older law, Sablevein replied. The river's memory. The silt elders do not forget. The Pearl Court does not tolerate coerced vows. Liora's throat token pulsed softly at the mention of tolerance, as if reminding her that even her own agreement had been weighed. Her stomach twisted again. Was my agreement coerced? She asked, hating that the question mattered. Sablevein's gaze snapped to her. In his eyes, something hard and protective flared. No, he said, and for the first time his voice carried heat. You were afraid. You were pressured by circumstance. But you chose. That is why you are dangerous to Merowan. He exhaled, and the heat faded into controlled steadiness. A willing voice cannot be used without consequence. Liora swallowed. The idea that her willingness was a weapon made her feel both stronger and sick. They rested only long enough for Sablevein's pallor, if pallor could apply to a spirit, to ease by a fraction. Then he rose, the shawl still on his shoulders. He did not remove it. He simply looked at Liora as if waiting for her to decide whether she would reclaim it. She left it. They returned to the water. This time, when Liora breathed the river into her lungs, she did not panic. The token's cold pulse steadied her. The water accepted her, pressing her hair back, pulling her skirts into slow motion. They traveled for what felt like hours, though time in the river did not behave like time under sun. Sometimes Lyra's mind drifted into strange calm, and then she would startle back, remembering the valley, the mill wheel, her father's face. At last, the corridor opened into a vast chamber where the water was thick with suspended silt, glowing faintly as if each grain held a memory of light. The floor was not sand here but layered sediment, ridged like the rings of old trees. Figures sat half buried in the silt like stones that had learned to breathe. Their bodies were humanoid, but their skin was the color of riverbed clay, patterned with darker lines like strata. Their hair drifted around their heads in slow clouds, and their eyes were dull until Sablevein approached. Then, one by one, their eyes opened, gleaming with wet age. Sablevein's posture changed. He did not bow, exactly, but he lowered his head in a gesture that felt like respect. "Elder Catherine," he said, voice resonant through the silted water. "I come with a mortal witness." The silt stirred. One of the elders, broad-shouldered, heavy as a boulder, shifted slightly, and the movement sent a wave of glowing grains drifting like snowfall. When he spoke, the sound was slow and deep, like water moving under ice. "Sablevein," Catherine said. "You come without your seat." Lyra's throat token pulsed, as if bracing. Sablevein's gaze held the elder's. "My crown surfaced," he said. It was caught by her hand. Catherine's eyes slid to Liora. The weight of that gaze was older than hills. Liora fought the urge to look away. She lifted her chin, the way she did with proud customers who tried to haggle her father's flour down to nothing. "I didn't know what it was," she said, and her truth rose clean. Catherine's gaze did not soften. "Ignorance is common," he said. "Consequences are not." Lyra's breath caught. Bubbles trembled at her lips. Sablevein's hand brushed her forearm, barely a touch, but enough to steady her. "We need memory," Sablevein said to Catherine. "We need to know what vow was spoken under crown. We need to know who spoke it." The silt thickened around the elders as if the chamber itself leaned in to listen. Catherine's eyes narrowed. "Do you come to ask," he said, "or do you come to demand?" Sablevein's jaw tightened. "I come to prevent the valley from drying," he said. Catherine's gaze held him, unblinking. Then the elder's heavy hand lifted, fingers spreading slowly. Silt rose in a curtain. And within it, shapes began to form, shadows moving through glowing grains, like images caught in suspended dust. Lyra's stomach dropped, because she knew, suddenly, that she was about to see something the river had never meant to show a mortal. Catherine's voice rolled through the chamber, solemn as a verdict. "Then watch," he said. "And do not flinch from what the river remembers." The silt did not swirl randomly. It rose in sheets that folded into one another with the precision of a loom, each grain catching pale light and holding it, until the chamber became a living tapestry. Shapes emerged, first indistinct, then sharp enough to make Lyra's breath hitch. She saw the river as it had been before the stillness, moving, singing, laughing over stones. She saw the millstreams bend from above, the valley stitched with fields. Then the image slid upriver, faster than any fish could swim, following the water's memory as if it were a road. A man stood on a bank where the reeds were trampled. He wore a heavy cloak, and his boots were too fine for mud. Joran Vask. Lyra knew him the way one knows a storm cloud by its shape, by the promise of trouble. He held his hands out over the water, not in prayer, but in ownership. Behind him, Laboris hauled stones into place, building a low weir that pinched the river's course. The water foamed against it, confused, then forced itself through a narrowed gap. Vask's mouth moved. Lyra could not hear the words, but she saw his expression, tight with determination, bright with hunger. The vision shifted, plunging beneath the surface. Another figure waited in the river's deep. He hovered in still water like a man suspended between breaths. His hair was slicked back, dark and neat, his skin too smooth to have ever been worn by sun or silt. Around his neck hung a chain of small, pale pearls that glowed faintly, no ornament, but a sign. And in his hands, the river crown. Lyra's stomach turned. The crown gleamed coldly, its reed braid alive, its pearls dimmed as if smudged by something unclean. Sablevein's grip on her forearm tightened. Not painful, but enough to tell her he was there, and that what they were seeing cut him too. The figure in the deep lifted the crown toward the river as if offering it, then, smiling with a softness that felt wrong, tilted it toward Vask's reflection above, as though speaking to the man through water and law. Bubbles rose from the figure's mouth. Not loose, wandering bubbles. These formed into rings and lines, a language made visible. The bubbles did not drift upward. They sank, heavy, sinking into the silt like seeds pressed into soil. The river around them shuddered. Lyra felt it in her throat token, a pulse that was not hers, a tightening like a knot pulled too hard. The silted tapestry darkened at the edges, and the deep figure's eyes gleamed. Merowan. The name came to Lyra not as a sound, but as certainty, like the river had whispered it into her bones. In the vision, Merowan lowered the crown to the water's surface and spoke again, bubbles swelling and sliding into place. Vask above placed his hand into the river, fingers dipping into the current as if sealing a deal. Then the crown flared faintly, not bright like blessing, but sharp like a blade. The river's flow faltered. The water's song snapped into silence. The vision collapsed. Silt fell away in slow snowfall, settling back into ridges on the chamber floor. The light dimmed. The elder's eyes remained open, heavy with old patience. Lyra realized she had been holding her breath even though she did not need to. Sablevein's hand fell from her arm. For a heartbeat, he looked as if he might fracture into current and disappear. Catherine's voice rolled through the chamber. Vow was spoken, he said, slow and inexorable. Under crown. Between mortal greed and oathbroker craft. Lyra's mouth opened, the taste of anger sharp as iron. He can't, she said, words tumbling out in bubbles. He can't just buy the river. Catherine's gaze slid to her. He can attempt, the elder said. And attempts have consequences. Sablevein's voice came low, controlled with effort. Merowan used court law, he said. He used my regalia to seat a binding that restricts flow unless terms are met. Catherine's heavy fingers shifted in the silt. Terms, he echoed. Sablevein's jaw tightened. Payment, he said. Not coin. Concession. Rights. His eyes were dark with restrained fury. He would make water a contract purchased by those who can bleed others dry. Lyra's fists clenched, her nails biting her palms through wet cloth. So we tell the courts, she said. We show them this memory and Memory is not always admissible, Catherine interrupted, and the words landed like a stone. Not without witness. Not without record. Not without proper craft to bind the truth into something that cannot be denied. Lyra's throat token pulsed sharply, as if offended by the idea that truth could be rejected. Sablevein lifted his gaze. The Pearl Court, he said. Catherine inclined his head, slow. Pearl holds truth without rot, he said. Pearl can carry vow echo. Pearl can preserve what the river remembers. His eyes narrowed. But pearl can also be bought, if the maker is weak. Sablevein's mouth tightened. Mavrin is not weak. At the name, something in Lyra's chest eased by a fraction. A person. An ally she could imagine. A place where rules might not be entirely jagged. Catherine's gaze returned to Lyra. Mortal, he said, as if tasting the word. You saw. Yes, Lyra answered, and her bubble rose clean and bright. And you understood. Catherine pressed. Lyra swallowed. Enough, she said. Enough to know what was done. Another bubble rose, clear. Catherine's eyes gleamed. Then you carry burden, he said. In the Pearl Court, truth cannot be hidden, but it can be twisted. Hold to the shape of what you know. The elder's hand lifted again, and the silt around them settled more firmly, as if sealing a door behind them. You may go, Catherine said. But remember, the river is not only water. It is law. And law is not kind. It is only consistent. The chamber's current shifted. A corridor opened, not by stone moving, but by the water choosing a direction. Sablevein took Lyra's hand again. His skin felt colder than before. His fingers trembled once, so slight she might have missed it if she were not watching for any weakness. "You are holding the thread," she said quietly. Sablevein's gaze flicked to her, and for a moment she saw raw exhaustion beneath the River King composure. "Yes," he admitted. "You should have told me it would hurt you like this," she said, and surprised herself with the way the words came out, less accusation now, more concern. Sablevein's thumb shifted over her knuckles, a careful pressure. "If I speak too much of my pain," he said, "you may try to carry it." Lyra scoffed, but it had no bite. "I can't carry a river," she muttered. "No," Sablevein said, and something like the faintest warmth threaded his voice. "But you carry a truth that can free it." They traveled through passages that seemed more urgent now, currents sliding them forward with less ceremony. The river tasted sharper, as if it, too, had grown impatient. As they moved, Lyra began to notice small signs that made her stomach tighten. Patches of pale moss turned brittle on the stones. Tiny fish drifted sluggishly, their movements slow, as if the water no longer had enough will to hold them up. In one cavern, a garden of submerged lilies drooped, their petals curling inward as though trying to protect their hearts from an unseen cold. "It's getting worse," she whispered. Sablevein did not deny it. "Merowan presses the binding," he said. "He is impatient. He wants the valley to beg." "Then we don't let it," Lyra said fiercely. The corridor opened into a wide channel lined with smooth stone pillars. Between the pillars hung strands of something that looked like glass thread, shimmering faintly. As they swam through, the threads vibrated with a soft hum that made Lyra's teeth ache. Sablevein slowed. "Quiet," he murmured. Lyra's throat token pulsed, urging obedience. She clamped her mouth shut. A figure drifted ahead, moving with elegant ease. He wore a robe that clung like ink to his body, and the robe's edges were embroidered with tiny reed patterns, court insignia. Pearls gleamed at his throat. Merowan did not appear surprised to see them. He smiled as if they were expected guests arriving precisely on schedule. "Sablevein," Merowan said, and his voice was smooth as still water. "How thin you look." Sablevein's eyes narrowed. The water around him tightened, a subtle shift that made Lyra feel as if she stood beside a cliff. Merowan's gaze slid to Lyra. It was not the measuring gaze of Relune. It was the appreciative gaze of someone inspecting a useful tool. "And you," Merowan said, "must be the miller's daughter. How fortunate that you found what was lost." Lyra's stomach churned. Her throat token pulsed hard, as if bracing for lies. She forced her voice steady. "You used the crown," she said. "I saw." Merowan's smile did not falter. "You saw a memory," he corrected gently. "Memories are slippery. They change shape in the telling." "The river remembers," Lyra shot back. "The river remembers many things," Merowan replied, still calm. "Floods. Drownings. Broken bridges. Lovers who promised and failed. Memory is not morality." Sablevein's voice cut through the water like a blade. "What have you bound?" he demanded. Merowan tilted his head. "Order," he said. "Efficiency. A system that does not depend on your moods and whims." Sablevein's fingers tightened on Lyra's hand. She felt the tremor again, faint but there. "My moods," Sablevein echoed, and the word carried such restrained fury that Lyra's skin prickled beneath the water. Merowan spread his hands in a gesture of peace. "Sovereigns are not wrong to be sovereign," he said. "But you are antiquated. A river must serve those who shape its banks. Mortals build, plant, harvest. They deserve reliability. Contracts. Guarantees." Lyra's anger flared hot enough to make her chest ache. "Guarantees for who?" she demanded. "For Vask. For the man who already takes more than his share." Merowan's gaze softened in a practiced way. "For those willing to pay the cost of stability," he said. "Scarcity is a tool. It teaches value." Lyra's throat token pulsed sharply, and she realized her breath had gone shallow. Sablevein's voice came low. "You still the river to make them kneel," he said. You threaten children and orchards and wells to teach value. Merowan's smile thinned. Not children, he said, as if offended. Collateral is regrettable, but unavoidable. Collateral. Liora tasted bile. She tried to step forward, but Sablevein held her back with a subtle pull. Merowan's gaze returned to Liora. You are brave, he said, like a compliment. And you are positioned in a way few mortals ever are. His eyes gleamed. Tell me, miller's daughter, do you wish to save your valley quickly? Lyra's throat token tightened, warning. She forced herself not to answer too fast. Merowan drifted closer, careful not to cross an invisible line Sablevein's presence seemed to draw in the water. I can release the binding, Merowan said softly. Not entirely. That would be irresponsible. But I can loosen it. Enough to restore flow. Enough to turn your mill wheel as it should. Lyra's heart hammered. And what do you want? She asked, because every bargain had teeth. Merowan's smile returned, gentle as a lullaby. A vow, he said. From you. Sablevein's grip tightened. No, he said, the word a current slamming into stone. Merowan's gaze slid to Sablevein with mild amusement. A vow from her is not a vow from you, he murmured. And she is the one who touched the crown. She is already entangled. Lyra's throat token pulsed painfully. Truth demanded she admit it. She was entangled. She could feel the river's attention on her like a hand on her back. What vow? She forced out. Merowan's eyes gleamed. That you will place the crown where I direct, he said. At the throne rail, yes, but under proper terms. Under modern terms. His smile sharpened. And that you will become the river's mortal steward in the valley. The voice that ensures compliance. Lyra's skin went cold. You want me to help you control my own people. I want you to save them, Merowan corrected, still soft. With a simple promise. Sablevein's voice came low, thick with warning. He speaks like calm water before a sinkhole, he said to Liora. Do not step. Lyra's breath shook. She looked at Merowan, at the polished hunger in his eyes, at the way he spoke of her valley like a ledger entry. Then she looked at Sablevein, at the strain in his posture, at the faint tremor he tried to hide, at the way his gaze never left her as if her choice mattered more than his pride. A simple promise, Merowan had said. But Liora had grown up beside water. She knew that the simplest-looking currents could drag a person under. I won't vow to you, she said, and the words came out clear. Her bubble rose bright, clean, truth without decoration. Not to save them. Not to save myself. Merowan's smile lingered for a heartbeat, as if he could not quite believe her refusal. Then it faded, leaving his face smooth and cold. How noble, he said softly. How costly. He lifted one hand, and the glass threads hanging between the pillars vibrated harder. The hum in Lyra's bones sharpened into pain. Her throat token flared cold, and for a moment her breath stuttered, water catching in her lungs like panic. Sablevein stepped forward, placing himself between Liora and the threads. The water around him surged, not violently, but with authority. The humming eased slightly. Merowan's eyes narrowed. You are weak without your seat, he said, no longer gentle. You cannot protect her indefinitely. Sablevein's voice came like a deep undertow. And you cannot compel a willing vow without rot, he said. Pearl will judge you. Merowan's lips curved faintly. Then bring your pearl, he said. Bring your mortal witness. His gaze pinned Liora. We will see what truth costs you when the valley begins to crack. Then he drifted backward, dissolving into darker water, leaving the glass threads quivering behind him like spider silk. For a long moment, Liora could not speak. Her lungs worked too fast. Her throat token pulsed hard, then eased, as if calming after danger. Sablevein's hand found hers again, firmer now. He wanted your promise, he said quietly. Because your willingness is the key. Lyra's voice came rough. He threatened my home. Sablevein's gaze held hers. He will do worse, he said. He will force the valley to desperation so that desperation will coerce what his words cannot. Lyra's eyes stung. She blinked hard, and the tears that slipped free did not fall. They became tiny beads that floated, shimmering. I'm afraid, she admitted, and her bubble rose bright as pearl. Sablevein's expression shifted, something like pain, something like tenderness restrained by law. He lifted his free hand slowly, deliberately, and touched only the edge of her wrist, as if asking permission even for that. You may be afraid, he said. And still be the river's answer. Liora did not pull away. They swam on, urgency tightening around them like a current. The river's passages seemed to narrow, then widen, then narrow again, as if the world itself was adjusting to strain. Ahead, a faint glow warmed the water, soft, luminous, like moonlight caught inside a shell. The Pearl Court, Sablevein said, voice low. Liora stared into the light and felt her throat token pulse, steady now, like a promise the river made to itself. She squeezed Sablevein's hand once, not as surrender, but as agreement to keep walking. And this time, when he squeezed back, the tremor in his fingers was answered by something else, something steadier, something that felt, for a heartbeat, like trust. The light ahead was not firelight and not sun. It was the kind of glow that lived inside shells and under river stones, soft, milky, steady as a held note. As Liora and Sablevein moved toward it, the water warmed by a fraction, and the sharp ache in her bones from Merowan's glass threads eased into something like a bruise. The corridor opened into a wide basin that felt less like a cavern and more like a hall. Pearls were set into the walls in spiraling constellations, each one faintly luminous, each one etched with a mark so fine it could have been a scratch, until Liora realized the marks were tiny words, written in a script that shimmered as if alive. The floor was a smooth bed of pale stone veined with darker lines, like a map of tributaries. Between the pearl constellations hung curtains of thin, translucent material that rippled in the current like silk. They did not sway randomly, they moved with deliberate grace, parting when Sablevein approached and falling closed behind them as if sealing the way. Figures drifted through the space, artisans and attendants, their fingers stained with nacre dust, their hair braided with river grass. None looked directly at Liora for long. Their glances slid away quickly, respectful or wary, as though a mortal in their halls was a rare and fragile occurrence. Sablevein slowed, his posture changing. He did not soften, exactly, but something in him tightened into restraint. His hand remained around Liora's, but he loosened the grip enough that she could feel the choice in it. If you wish to release me here, he said quietly, you may. Liora's throat token pulsed, steady. The words were not a command. They were an offering. She did not let go. If I release you, she murmured, will I float away and get lost in your courts? A flicker crossed his face, almost amusement, quickly buried. You would not be ignored, he said. Not now. That did not comfort her the way it should have. Being seen by the river's deep laws was not the same as being safe. They reached the center of the hall, where a broad table of stone sat like an altar. Upon it lay tools, thin pearl knives, reed brushes, bowls of shimmering dust, and small discs of mother-of-pearl that glowed faintly with captured light. A woman stood behind the table, her sleeves rolled and her hands wet with fine white powder. Her hair was a dark braid looped over one shoulder, threaded with tiny shells. Her eyes were clear and sharp, the kind of gaze that looked for flaws in craft and character alike. Mavrin. Liora recognized her not by memory, but by the way the hall seemed to straighten around her, as if the Pearl Court took its own integrity personally. Mavrin looked at Sablevein first. Her gaze narrowed. You are holding threadflow, she said. It wasn't a question. Sablevein inclined his head. Until the crown is seated. You will fracture if you keep doing it without proper support, Mavrin replied, blunt as a chisel. Then her eyes slid to Liora's throat, and her expression sharpened further. And you, she said, voice quieter but no less exact. Your token was impressed under agreement without pearl witness. Liora's stomach tightened. It works, she said defensively. I can breathe. I can speak. Mavrin lifted a hand. Working is not the same as lawful, she said. A poorly seated token can be exploited. It can be stolen. It can be turned. Cold crawled up Liora's spine. Sablevein's hand tightened around hers again, just a fraction. I brought her, he said, so the token could be seated properly. And so the Pearl Court can bind witness to what the river remembers. Mavrin's gaze held his. You want a truth disk, she said. Yes, Sablevein replied. Mavrin exhaled slowly. The pearled constellations overhead pulsed once, as if the hall itself listened. Then we do this cleanly, she said. With consent. With clarity. With cost acknowledged. Lyra's throat token pulsed sharply at the word cost. Mavrin gestured to the stone table. Come closer, she told Lyra. Place your hands here. Lyra hesitated. The table looked harmless, but so had Merowan's smile. Still, this hall felt different. The air water around Mavrin did not taste of hunger. It tasted of precision. She stepped forward and placed her palms on the cool stone. The water around the table felt thicker, denser, as if it held its breath. Mavrin leaned in and studied the base of Lyra's throat. Her fingers hovered, not touching. This impression, she said, mostly to herself. A river mark, not a pearl seal. Her eyes flicked to Sablevein. You used your authority. Sablevein did not deny it. There was no time. There is never time, Mavrin said flatly. That is why mistakes become tragedies. Lyra's cheeks warmed with a strange embarrassment, as if her throat was a ledger entry being criticized for messy handwriting. Mavrin reached for a small disc of mother-of-pearl and a thin reed brush. She dipped the brush into a bowl of shimmering dust. This will sting, she warned Lyra. Not because pearl is cruel, but because it insists on shape. Lyra swallowed. Do it, she said, because fear did not change necessity. Mavrin touched the brush to the skin at the base of Lyra's throat. Cold flared, sharp, bright, immediate, like snowmelt poured down her spine. Lyra gasped, and bubbles burst from her lips. The sting spread outward in a ring, then tightened, drawing the token's impression into clearer edges. Her lungs hitched. For a heartbeat, the water in her chest felt heavy, as if her breath might sink. Sablevein's hand closed over her wrist, steadying without squeezing. He did not pull her. He simply anchored her. Breathe, he said softly. Lyra forced herself to. The cold eased. The token pulsed once, then settled into a steadier rhythm, less like an impressed pebble, more like a seated stone in a wall. Mavrin lifted the brush and held the pearl disc near Lyra's throat. The disc glowed faintly. Now, Mavrin said. Speak your name. Liora Fenwick, Lyra said. A bubble rose, clear, bright, and touched the pearl disc. It did not pop. It sank into the disc like a bead dropping into wax. Again, Mavrin said. Liora Fenwick, Lyra repeated, voice steadier. Another bubble. Another bead of truth caught. Mavrin's eyes narrowed. Speak what you fear, she said. Lyra froze. Her throat token pulsed, urging truth. Her mind scrambled for something safe to admit, something small. But the hall felt like it would know the difference between a pebble and a boulder. She swallowed. I fear I won't come back, she said, and the words hurt worse than the sting had. I fear my father will stand at an empty mill. I fear the valley will dry before I can fix what I started. The bubble that carried it rose bright and flawless, and sank into the disc with a soft shimmer. Mavrin's gaze softened by a fraction, not kind, exactly, but honest. Good, she said. Fear acknowledged does not leak into lies. Then her eyes shifted to Sablevein. Speak your name, she told him. Sablevein's jaw tightened. He looked at Lyra first, as if checking whether she minded him stepping into this with her. Then he faced Mavrin. Sablevein, he said. A bubble rose from him too, dark-edged, heavy with depth, yet it did not sink. It hovered briefly, then slid into the pearl disc as if the disc recognized sovereign current. Mavrin's fingers stilled. For a breath, the hall's pearl constellations pulsed brighter. Speak what you fear, she said to him. Silence tightened around them. Even the artisans drifting through the hall seemed to slow, as if the entire court leaned in to listen. Sablevein's gaze dropped. When he spoke, his voice was low. I fear, he said, that if I love what is mortal, it will be used to bind my river. I fear that devotion will make me weak enough to be purchased. I fear the river will suffer because my heart is not stone. The bubble that carried his words rose, dark at the edges, luminous at the center, and sank into the pearl disc with a slow, steady shimmer. Lyra's chest tightened. She did not know what to do with that kind of honesty from something that had first appeared like a command made flesh. Mavrin lifted the disc and held it between them. Inside its nacre surface, faint threads of light now drifted, captured truths, held without rot. This is a truth disc, Mavrin said. It will carry witness into any court that honors Pearl. Her eyes sharpened. And it will not tolerate coercion. If either of you is forced into vow speech, it will crack. Sablevein inclined his head. Then Merowan cannot twist what we bring. Mavrin's mouth tightened. Do not be so certain, she said. Twisting truth is harder than twisting lies, but it is not impossible when desperation is involved. As if summoned by the word, a tremor passed through the water, thin and sharp, like a wire snapped taut. Lyra's token flared cold. Her lungs tightened. Sablevein's posture snapped upright. His head turned toward the hall's far end, where the curtains rippled violently as if struck by an unseen current. A messenger, a small river spirit shaped like a darting fish of light, burst through the curtains and spiraled toward them. It circled Sablevein's head, then darted toward Lyra, pulsing. Images flashed across Lyra's mind, sudden and brutal. The millstreams bend under harsh sun, cracked mud where water should be, Edda's hands gripping the millhouse beam, a village child holding a cup under a dry pump. Then another image, stone marker stones upriver being smashed by men with hammers. The old channel stones that guided seasonal flow, shattered into rubble. Joran Vask. Lyra's stomach plunged. His breaking the channel stones, she breathed. Sablevein's face went very still. The water around him tightened, darkening slightly. Lyra felt the river inside him stir like something waking angry. He is tearing the river's agreements from the land, Sablevein said, voice low and dangerous. Mavrin swore softly, an odd sound in a court built of ritual. If those stones break, she said, the river above loses its lawful anchors. Even if you seat the crown, the flow may return wild. Unchecked. Lyra's heart hammered. People will get hurt. Sablevein's eyes flashed. Yes. The word was not agreement. It was a verdict. He took a step, as if to surge upward to rise through the river and answer vandalism with flood. Lyra's hand shot out, grabbing his sleeve. Don't, she said, voice raw. Sablevein's gaze snapped to her. In it she saw the river's older instinct, punish, reclaim, sweep away obstacles. The kind of instinct that did not sort guilty from innocent when water ran hard. They are breaking my river, he said, and the truth of it was so deep it shook her. And if you flood, Lyra whispered, holding tight, the river will break us too. Children. Homes. The mill. You'll save the river's pride and drown the people it's meant to feed. Sablevein's jaw clenched. The water around his shoulders shivered. Mavrin stepped closer, holding the truth disc up between them like a lamp. Sablevein, she said sharply. Look at your own fear. Speak it before it drives you. Sablevein's breath, if it could be called breath, hitched. His gaze flicked to the disc. To the faint threads of truth inside. To the captured confession about his heart. For a heartbeat he looked like he might shatter, like the thread flow he held would snap and fling the valley into dryness all at once. Lyra squeezed his sleeve harder. Please, she said, and the word came out as a bubble that rose bright and clean. No manipulation. No bargain. Just a request that held her whole heart in it. The token at her throat pulsed warm for the first time, not with heat, but with steadiness. Sablevein closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the darkness around him eased. The water loosened its threatening coil. I will not flood, he said, voice hoarse with restraint. Not while innocents stand in the current's path. Mavrin exhaled slowly. Good, she said. Then we move. Move where? Lyra asked, though she already knew. Mavrin's gaze pinned her. To the throne rail, she said. Now. Before Merowan finishes tightening the binding and the valley's desperation becomes a weapon. Sablevein extended his hand to Mavrin. She placed the truth disc into his palm. And your token, Mavrin said to Lyra, lifting her fingers toward Lyra's throat but not touching. It is seated now. Which means it is also linked. Cold crawled under Lyra's skin again. Linked to what? To the court network, Mavrin replied. To Pearl. To law. Her eyes hardened. Merowan will be able to sense you more clearly now. And if he has purchased any weak artisan's craft, he may try to pull your token from you like a hook. Lyra's stomach turned. Can he do that? He can try, Mavrin said grimly. Which is why you do not travel alone through open channels. Sablevein's hand closed around Lyra's. She will not be taken, he said, and it was not bravado. It was a vow shaped like resolve, careful not to trip into binding, but fierce all the same. They left the Pearl Court in a surge of motion, the curtains parting before them like water made obedient by urgency. As they swam, the river felt tighter, more strained. Currents that had been calm now ran in sharp, narrow lines, as if the world's flow had been drawn through a pinched throat. Lyra's lungs worked faster. The token kept her breathing steady, but fear made her chest want to seize anyway. They passed through a channel of black stone, then a hall lined with reeds that whispered against one another in a language Lyra could not understand but felt like warning. The water tasted metallic. The light dimmed. Then the pressure changed. The current lurched sideways as if something had yanked it. Lyra's body spun. Her skirt tangled around her legs. For an instant she lost sight of Sablevein's face. Cold flared at her throat. Not the steady cold of her token, but a sharp, invasive tug like a finger hooking under a necklace and pulling. Lyra gasped. Water caught in her chest. Panic slammed into her. She clapped her hand to her throat. The token pulsed wildly, then faltered. A figure emerged from the dark ahead, not Merowan himself, but one of his agents, a court attendant with pearls at his throat and eyes too empty, drifting forward with hands outstretched as if to take what he had been told to take. Token, the attendant's voice murmured through water. By order of. No. Lyra tried to shout, but her voice came out as choking bubbles. The token's cold flared again, dragged sideways. Sablevein surged into view like a dark wave. He slammed his palm against the current between the attendant and Lyra, and the water thickened into something almost solid, an invisible wall of pressure. The attendant recoiled, but the tug on Lyra's throat did not stop. It was not the attendant's hand pulling. It was the court network itself, something Merowan was reaching through. Mavrin's warning rang in Lyra's ears. Sablevein's eyes flashed. He reached for Lyra, but his fingers hesitated. Touch could bind. And binding could be exploited. Lyra's breath stuttered. Water felt suddenly heavy again, like drowning reclaiming its right. Sablevein, she choked, panic turning her name for him into a plea. His jaw clenched. Decision snapped into place. He pulled her against him. Not in a romantic sweep, not in triumph, just in necessity, chest to shoulder, his hand cupping the back of her neck with careful firmness. The cold of him pressed into her skin, and the water around them tightened as if the river itself gathered to listen. Listen to me, he said, voice low and absolute in her mind. Speak truth. I can't, she tried, but her breath broke. Speak truth, he repeated. Not to me. To the river. The token at her throat flared, then pulsed once, demanding. Lyra's mind scraped for something, anything, to hold on to that wasn't terror. She remembered the moment she'd offered the crown into his hand. The way the river had shuddered, remembering how to move. She remembered her father's face. Bring our river home. Her lungs burned, not from lack of air, but from fear. She forced words out anyway, bubbles bursting from her lips in a frantic stream. I don't belong here, she said, and the truth tasted like salt. I'm afraid. I don't want to die in the dark. I don't want my father to stand alone. I don't want. The tug at her throat tightened, as if angered by her refusal to be quiet. Lyra's eyes stung. She kept speaking. But I will not be used, she said, voice stronger now. I will not promise what I don't choose. I will return the crown to free the river, not to sell it. Not to bind it. Not to buy safety with someone else's suffering. The bubbles that carried her words rose bright and clean, and instead of drifting away, they spiraled around her throat like a small halo of light. The tug jerked, then slipped, like a hook losing purchase in slick stone. Lyra sucked in a breath. Water filled her lungs smoothly again. The token settled, pulsing steady. Sablevein's grip around her eased, but he did not let go completely. He held her as if she were something precious and breakable, and the knowledge of that, clean, unspoken, undeniable, hit her harder than any court law. The attendant floated in the dark, trembling now, as if the backlash from failed coercion had stunned him. Sablevein's gaze snapped to the agent, cold as winter current. "Go," Sablevein said, and the word carried the weight of sovereign water. "Tell your master he cannot pluck what is willingly seated." The attendant fled, turning into darkness like a startled eel. Lyra's hands shook. She clung to Sablevein's sleeve, breathing hard even though her breath came easy. He looked down at her, eyes deep and troubled. His thumb brushed once along the edge of her jaw, barely a touch, as if he still asked permission with every movement. "You spoke," he said. "I didn't know I could do that," she whispered. "The token is not only a leash," he said, voice rough. "It is a conduit. When you speak truth, it strengthens. When you try to survive with half words, it becomes vulnerable." Lyra swallowed. Her chest ached with the weight of what she'd almost lost: breath, voice, agency. "And you," she said, because she could hear strain in him too. "You shouldn't have." "I did what I chose," he said, and his bubble rose bright. "Truth." They moved again, faster now, the river's urgency pressing them forward. The corridors widened into a vast chamber where the water gleamed faintly gold, as if lit from within. Ahead, the current split into many thin strands that braided and unbraided like hair. The floor rose into a stone dais shaped like a shallow bowl. At its center ran a thin, perfect rill, water so clear it looked like glass. The throne rill. Lyra felt it immediately. The way her token pulsed in awe. The way her skin prickled. The way the river itself seemed to hold a deeper breath here, older than the stillness above. At the edge of the dais stood Merowan. This time he was not smiling. His eyes gleamed with irritation and cold intent, and around his hands swirled thin lines of bubble script, vows half-spoken, ready to snap shut like traps. "You arrive late," Merowan said, voice smooth but sharp-edged. "The valley begins to learn humility." Sablevein's posture locked into still authority. In his hand, the truth disk glowed faintly. "We arrive in time," Sablevein said. "And we bring Pearl." Merowan's gaze flicked to the disk, and for the briefest moment his expression tightened, an involuntary flinch. "Ah," he said. "You found Mavrin's conscience." Mavrin was not with them, yet her work hung in the water between them like a blade. Lyra stepped forward before she could think better of it. Fear tried to grab her ankles. She shook it off. "You used the crown," she said. "You bound the river with a vow spoken under regalia. You worked with Joran Vask to break the valley's water agreements." Merowan's eyes slid over her, cool and appraising. "And you," he said softly, "are still only a miller's daughter." Lyra's throat token pulsed hard, demanding that she not let his words change her truth. "I'm a witness," she said. "And I'm willing." The moment the word left her, the water shivered. The throne rill's thin current brightened, as if listening. Merowan's gaze sharpened. "Willing to do what?" he asked, and the softness in his voice was suddenly dangerous. "To offer the crown? To seat it? To bind Sablevein properly to terms that ensure stability?" Sablevein's hand tightened around the truth disk. "She will not vow to you," he said. Merowan's lips curved slightly. "She doesn't have to vow to me," he murmured. "She only has to fear enough to place the crown wrongly." Lyra's stomach turned. "Wrongly?" Tightening the binding. Merowan lifted his hand, and bubble script flared, thin rings and lines spinning through the water. Lyra felt pressure in her chest, the beginning of compulsion, like a polite hand trying to steer her mind into a corridor. Her token flared cold. Sablevein stepped forward, placing himself between Merowan's script and Lyra. The water around him surged, not in violence, but in a protective wall of current. "You cannot compel at the throne rill," Sablevein said, voice low. "Older law holds here." Merowan's smile returned, but it was brittle. "Older law," he echoed. "And yet you stand here without your crown. Without your seat." He tilted his head. "You are a river king with a dry river above. How long do you think your restraint will last when your people suffer?" My people, Sablevein repeated, and the words came out like a confession. Lyra's heart clenched. She saw, suddenly, how Merowan's trap worked. Make the River King choose between flood and drought. Make him fail either way. Then sell the solution. Merowan's gaze returned to Liora. You could end this, he said softly. Place the crown into the rill. Speak the vow I taught you. Ensure your valley's flow returns immediately. Ensure your father's mill turns without interruption. His eyes gleamed. A simple act. A simple phrase. A simple mercy. Lyra's throat token pulsed sharply, as if warning, simple is how sinkholes begin. She looked at Sablevein. He did not tell her what to do. He did not command. He did not bargain. He simply watched her with an expression that held two truths at once, that he wanted the river saved, and that her choice had to be hers. The knowledge steadied her like a hand on her back. Lyra lifted her chin and faced Merowan. You keep calling it mercy, she said, voice clear. But you don't mean mercy. You mean control. Merowan's eyes narrowed. Careful, he murmured. Truth can drown as easily as lies. Lyra's token pulsed, urging her onward. I will place the crown, she said, and the water trembled, listening. Merowan's eyes flashed triumph for half a heartbeat. Then Lyra continued, voice steady as stone. But I will place it only as an offering, she said, not as a purchase. Not as a leash. Not under your terms. Merowan's smile snapped away. There are rules, he hissed. Yes, Lyra said, and her bubble rose bright. And I'm done letting you pretend you're the one who wrote them. For a heartbeat, the throne rill's thin current brightened so intensely it looked like a line of moonlight drawn across the chamber. Merowan lifted his hands sharply, bubble script flaring, trying to seize the moment to shove compulsion into the space between Lyra's intention and her act. The truth disc in Sablevein's hand pulsed. Mavrin had said it would crack if coerced. Sablevein thrust the disc forward into the space between Merowan's script and Lyra's throat. Pearl judges, he said. The disc flared and the bubble script that touched it shuddered as if struck by a hammer. Hairline fractures spidered across the disc's surface, not breaking it yet, but warning. The water around Merowan's hands darkened, tainted by the rot of attempted coercion. Merowan recoiled, furious now. You would let it crack, he snarled. It will crack on your corruption, Sablevein said, voice like undertow. Not on her willingness. Lyra's lungs filled with steady water. She stepped onto the stone dais, approaching the thin rill at its center. She did not have the crown. Sablevein's gaze snapped to her, then to Merowan, then back as if realizing the final, terrible truth of the right. The crown was still with him, kept from Merowan's grasp. And the right required that it be offered willingly by the one whose willingness mattered. Which meant he could not place it into her hands without making it a taking. He could only ask. Sablevein's expression tightened, pain and restraint in equal measure. He held the crown out toward her, its pale metal gleaming, its reed braid alive, its pearls faintly dim in the strained water. He did not move it into her grip. He simply offered it, arms steady, eyes locked on hers. Lyra, he said, voice rough. Will you take it? The question was not dramatic. It was not romantic flourish. It was consent made visible. Lyra's throat token pulsed warm. Merowan's gaze burned into her, hungry and furious. Above, somewhere beyond stone and water, the valley cracked and thirsted. Lyra met Sablevein's eyes and saw the truth he had spoken earlier, fear of loving mortal, fear of being bound by it. And yet he asked anyway, risking vulnerability because forcing her would be ruin. Her chest ached with a fierce, clean tenderness that had nothing to do with heat and everything to do with trust. Yes, she said softly. The bubble rose bright as pearl. I will. She reached out and took the river crown from his hands. The moment her fingers closed around it, the water shuddered not into stillness, but into attention. The throne rill brightened, and the crown's pearls seemed to inhale light. Merowan surged forward, bubble script flaring, but the river itself pressed against him now, thickening into resistance. Lyra stepped to the rill's edge and held the crown over the thin line of water. Her hands shook. Not from doubt of what she wanted, but from the weight of what she carried. She did not speak any phrase Merowan had offered. She did not speak any contract. She spoke the only words she could make true without rot. "I offer this back," she said, voice clear. "Not to bind. Not to bargain. Not to buy. Only to return what was stolen, and to free what was held." The bubble that carried her offering rose bright enough to hurt her eyes. She lowered the crown into the throne rill. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the river inhaled. A surge rippled through the rill, racing outward along the veined stone like lightning through roots. The crown flared, not sharp like a blade now, but radiant like a blessing. The reed braid unfurled slightly, alive, and the pearls shone as if each held a small moon. The binding snapped. Liora felt it as a release in her throat token, a loosening of pressure that had been there since she pulled the crown from her net. Sablevein staggered, breath catching as if a noose had been cut. The water around them rushed, not violently, but joyfully, like a laugh. Merowan screamed, an ugly sound in water, and his bubble script shattered into messy, sinking globules that turned dark as they fell. The truth disc in Sablevein's hand flashed once, then steadied, its fractures sealing into pale lines, scars that proved what had tried to touch it. The throne rill's current swelled into full flow, and the chamber filled with the sound the river had been holding back: motion, song, life returning. Lyra's knees went weak. She reached out blindly, and Sablevein caught her, careful, steady, arms closing around her without crushing. For a heartbeat, held in the river's renewed breath, she felt the simplest truth of all. The river was moving again. And she was still here. Merowan, pinned by thickened current and older law, writhed near the dais, his polished mask gone. His eyes glared up at Liora with hatred. "This isn't over," he snarled. Sablevein's gaze turned to him, cold and deep. "It is," he said, and the words carried the weight of restored seat. "You will answer." The water surged again, sweeping Merowan backward into the dark corridors beyond the throne rill, not as execution, but as arrest, carried toward judgment by the very law he had tried to corrupt. Liora clung to Sablevein's sleeve, trembling, breath steady now. She looked up at him. His eyes met hers, and in their depth she saw something new, relief edged with awe, as if he could not quite believe she had chosen freely, and that her choice had saved them both. "You offered," he said, voice low. "I did," she whispered. "And the river accepted," he replied. Around them, the throne rill sang with returning flow, and somewhere far above, the mill wheel would be turning again, steady, faithful, alive. The river's song did not stop when the binding broke. It spread. It threaded outward from the throne rill in bright, living lines, rushing through every carved channel and forgotten crack, filling the underworld corridors with motion that felt like laughter after long restraint. The water around Liora and Sablevein warmed, not with heat, but with relief, pressure easing, currents loosening into their true shapes. Liora floated in Sablevein's arms for a heartbeat longer than she needed, because her knees still felt unreliable and her mind still struggled to believe the world could change so quickly. The crown sat in the thin rill, now neither weapon nor lever but regalia returned to its rightful law. Its pearls glowed with clean light, and the reed braid lay calm, no longer bristling against wrong hands. Sablevein's hold remained careful, supportive without claiming. When Liora steadied, he loosened his arms at once, letting her stand on her own on the stone dais. That simple release did something in her chest. It reminded her that even now, especially now, he was choosing not to take. Merowan's scream had already been swallowed by the corridors. The current that carried him away left behind only a faint bitterness in the water, like silt stirred by a careless boot. The bitterness faded as the rill sang louder. From the shadows at the chamber's edge, the underwater courts arrived, not in a stampede, but in a controlled flood of officials and witnesses, reed scribes whose hair streamed like ink, silt elders drifting heavy as memory, pearl artisans whose fingers glittered with nacre dust. Relune of the reed chancellery came first, gliding to the dais with rigid authority. Her pale eyes flicked from the seated crown to Lyra's face to Sablevein's posture, measuring, recording, judging. Then Mavrin appeared, her dark braid trailing behind her like a calm line in moving water. When her gaze found Liora, it did not soften into sentiment. It sharpened into assessment, alive, breathing, token seated, will intact. Good, her look said. You were not taken. Kethrin drifted in last, settling near the dais like a boulder arriving at rest. His eyes watched the throne rail with patient inevitability, as if this outcome had always been possible, and their only job had been to remove the rot blocking it. Relun's voice rang through the chamber, clear, cold, formal. The binding is broken, she said. By offering. Her gaze pinned Liora. Name the offerer. Lyora's throat token pulsed once, steady and warm. She stepped forward, the current tugging at her skirts like a persistent hand. I am Liora Fenwick, she said. The bubble rose bright and clean. I offered the river crown back willingly, without coercion, to free the river from unlawful vow. Relun's eyes flicked to the pearl constellations embedded in the chamber walls. They pulsed faintly, as if acknowledging. And the sovereign, she demanded. Sablevein stepped forward. He looked different now. Not larger, not more dramatic, but steadier, as if a missing bone had been put back into place. The water around him did not tighten with strain anymore. It moved with him naturally, like breath. I am Sablevein, he said, and his bubble rose deep-edged and luminous. The river crown is seated. The river returns to lawful flow. Relun's jaw tightened. Merowan dusk held, she said, the name sharp as a chisel. He is accused of oath corruption, coercion, and unlawful binding under regalia. Mavrin lifted her hand, and the truth disk flashed in the water, its pale fracture lines visible like healed scars. Pearl records attempted coercion, she said. Pearl records witness. Pearl does not rot. Relun's pale eyes narrowed at the disk. Then her gaze slid to Liora again. Mortal, she said, your will is the hinge. Speak. Were you threatened? Were you compelled? Were you bound by fear into false agreement? Lyra's mouth went dry. She could feel the court's attention pressing on her, even with the river running free. This was still law. Still consequence. She thought of Merowan's words, simple mercy, simple phrase. She thought of the tug at her throat, the attempt to steal her breath. She thought of her father's cracked-knuckled hands on the mill beam, and the valley's wells sinking toward empty. I was afraid, she said, and the admission rose as bright truth. The valley was drying. My father could have lost everything. But I was not compelled to offer under Merowan's terms. He tried, and failed. I offered under my own words, because it was right. The bubble rose clean. The pearl constellations pulsed approval. Relun's expression remained severe, but something behind it loosened, an invisible knot of procedure that could now be tied off properly. Kethrin's deep voice rolled through the chamber. The river accepts, he said, as if finishing a sentence the water had begun. And what the river accepts becomes law. Relun turned sharply. Then law must reach above, she said. The mortal hand, Joran Vask, has broken channel stones. He has violated marker agreements and harmed the watershed. Sablevein's gaze went distant, as if he could feel the valley through every returning current. He will answer, he said. Lyra's stomach tightened. How? She asked, unable to stop herself. If you punish him with flood. Sablevein looked at her, and something in his eyes steadied her fear. Not with flood, he said. With consequence that fits the harm. He lifted one hand, palm up, and the water above it shaped into an image, faint, clear as glass. The millstream bend. The broken stones. Vask's men with hammers. The image held steady, a captured witness shaped from current itself. This will be carried to the surface courts, Sablevein said, voice controlled. And to the valley's elders. The river's agreements will be restored by hands that live above. Relun inclined her head once. The Reed Chancellery will record the violation, she said. We will bind the watershed's old agreements into reed script and seat them at the markerstones again, this time with pearl witness. Mavrin's fingers flexed. And I will make tokens, she said, for those tasked with repairing the stones. Tokens that allow them to work in wet places without endangering themselves, and tokens that prevent bribes from twisting their hands. Lyra's chest eased by a fraction. Practical. Measurable. Consequences that did not drown the innocent. But even as relief spread, A new tension tightened under it, because Liora could feel the throne real's attention still fixed on her. As if the river had not finished with her yet. Relun's gaze followed her inward shift. There remains the matter of the offering, she said, voice precise. A mortal willingly placed regalia into its seat. That act establishes standing. Lyra's throat token pulsed. Standing. As if her body itself was a legal document. Sablevein's posture went very still. His eyes turned to the crown seated in the rill, then to Liora, and something like caution passed through him, fear, perhaps, of what the courts might demand of her next. Catherine's deep voice came slow. The river does not allow such acts without weaving, he said. Willing offering binds relationship. Lyra's pulse stumbled. She looked at Sablevein. He did not look away. Relun's tone sharpened. The courts may name her, she said. Or the river may. But naming will happen. Mavrin drifted closer, studying Liora with that same uncompromising precision she had used at the stone table. Do you understand what you have done? She asked, not unkindly, but bluntly. I gave it back, Liora said, voice small in her own ears. Mavrin's eyes narrowed. You did more than return metal, she said. You spoke a vow shape without rot. You acted as the river's witness and its agent. That makes you anchored. Anchored. Like a stone set into a bank. Lyra's breath caught. Does that mean I can't go home? Sablevein's hand lifted slightly, as if he wanted to touch her but stopped himself at the edge of choice. Mavrin answered. It means you can go home, she said. But home will not be unchanged. The river will recognize you. It will respond to you. And the courts will watch what you do with that recognition. Relun's pale gaze pinned Liora. The river does not grant power freely, she said. If you are named, you must accept duty. Lyra's stomach twisted. Duty she could bear, she had carried duty all her life. But this was not sweeping a millhouse floor or hauling flour sacks. This was law and current and deep politics. Sablevein's voice cut through, quiet but firm. Do not load her with obligations she did not consent to, he said. That is how corruption begins. Relun's eyes narrowed. And yet she acted, Relun replied. Her action carries consequence. Sablevein's gaze held hers. Then let her choose the consequence, he said. The words settled in the water like a stone dropped gently, weighty, deliberate. Liora stared at him. Choose the consequence. Choose the name. Choose the duty. He was giving her the same respect he had given her at the moment of the crown, no taking, no forcing, only asking. The tenderness that rose in her chest was sharp enough to make her eyes sting. I want to go back, she said, voice shaking. I want to see my father. I want to hear the mill wheel turn. Her truth rose bright. And, she added, because it was no longer possible to hide the other truth even if she wanted to, I don't want the river to be alone again. Not with people like Merowan and Vask waiting to twist it. The bubble that carried that second truth rose even brighter. Sablevein's eyes darkened, not with anger now, but with something like wonder. As if he had not allowed himself to hope for those words. Catherine's voice rumbled. Then speak what you desire, he said. So the river can shape itself around it. Relun's gaze sharpened. Choose, she commanded, and for once the command did not feel like coercion. It felt like the court recognizing that choice was the only lawful foundation left. Lyora's throat token pulsed warm, steady as a heartbeat. She looked at the throne rill, at the crown seated there. She looked at the pearl constellations watching. She looked at Sablevein, whose posture held both sovereignty and restraint. She took a breath, water filling her lungs easily, and stepped closer to the rill. The current around her hands felt attentive, like a creature listening. I choose to be named, she said, and her bubble rose clean. Not as property. Not as a chain. As a partner, an anchor between the valley and the river's law. Relun's eyes narrowed, but did not object. Mavrin's mouth tightened in approval, so slight it was almost invisible. Sablevein's hand lifted again, hovering near Lyora's, still not touching. Liora continued, voice steadier now. I will keep the river's agreements in the valley, she said, as I've kept the mill's work. I will speak for the people to the river, and for the river to the people, so neither is used. The throne rail brightened. The crown's pearls flared softly, and the reed braid unfurled like a living wreath. A pulse of current rose from the rill and touched Lyra's throat token. Warmth spread through it, not heat, but recognition, like a hand clasping hers. Catherine's deep voice came like a verdict blessed by time. Bride of the River Crown, he said. The title did not feel like ownership. It felt like a bridge. Lyra's breath trembled. She looked at Sablevein, and in his eyes she saw something that made her throat tighten, relief so profound it bordered on reverence. Relune lifted her hand. Then law demands vow, she said, to define the partnership so it cannot be twisted. Lyra's stomach clenched at the word vow, but her token pulsed warm, not sharp. This vow was not a trap. It was a boundary. Mavrin stepped forward and held out a small pearl ring, no metal band, only a smooth loop of nacre that glowed softly. This is not ornament, she said. It is a witness. It will record what is spoken and prevent later rewriting. Sablevein's gaze flicked to Lyra, waiting. Lyra took the ring and slid it onto her finger. It settled with a faint, cool pulse, as if it had found the right place. Relune's voice became ritual. Speak. Lyra's heart hammered, but she kept her eyes on Sablevein. I, Liora Fenwick, she said, and her bubble rose bright, vow to guard the river's agreements in my valley. I will not sell the river's flow. I will not bind it with greed. I will speak truth when truth is demanded, and I will seek repair before punishment. The pearl ring pulsed, catching every word. Then Relune turned her pale gaze to Sablevein. And you, she said. Speak. Sablevein took a step closer. He did not touch Lyra's hands, but he stood within arm's reach, close enough that the water around them merged into one shared current. I, Sablevein, he said, and his voice rang deep and clear, vow to honor the valley's need. I will not withdraw flow to teach fear. I will not use my sovereign force to take what is not willingly given. I will guard my river from those who would commodify it, and I will treat my bride as partner, not vessel. Lyra's chest ached. The pearl ring pulsed again, steady, content. Relune's eyes narrowed, as if searching for loopholes. The pearl constellations above them glowed brighter instead, as if pleased by the clean shape of the words. Mavrin lifted her hand. Seal, she said. The sealing was not theatrical. It was intimate in the quietest way. Sablevein lifted his hand slowly, visibly, and waited until Lyra nodded. Then he took her fingers in his, palm to palm, and the water between them shimmered with 1,000 tiny bubbles. Each bubble held a fragment of their vows, bright and unbroken. They rose around their hands like a wreath of light, then drifted upward to dissolve into the pearl constellations, becoming part of court record and river memory. Sablevein leaned close, not rushing, not claiming. His forehead touched hers, cool and steady. Lyra closed her eyes. Their lips met in a brief, gentle kiss, chaste but profound, less about heat than about recognition. The river around them hummed, as if satisfied. When they drew back, Lyra's throat token pulsed in a new rhythm, still her own, but harmonized with something deeper. Catherine's heavy gaze lingered on them, then shifted away, as if his work was done. Flow returns, he said, and the statement was both blessing and fact. Relune lifted her hand in dismissal. Merowan will be tried, she said crisply. His pearls will be seized. His vow ledgers will be unraveled. He will repair what he corrupted. And Vask? Lyra asked, unable to keep the name from her tongue. Sablevein's gaze turned upward, toward the world above. The river will speak, he said. And the valley will answer. The underwater courts dispersed with the efficiency of tide turning. Artisans drifted away to prepare tokens and read scripts. Scribes carried their glowing lines of record into darker corridors. Even Relune's severity receded into procedure. Only Mavrin lingered a moment longer. She approached Lyra, eyes sharp. You did well, she said, and from her, the words were almost a tender thing. Lyra's lips trembled. I was terrified, she admitted. Good, Mavrin replied. Courage without fear is ignorance. She hesitated, then added, if you ever feel your token tug in ways that do not match truth, come to Pearl first. Do not try to bear it alone. Lyra nodded, swallowing hard. Thank you. Mavrin inclined her head once, then drifted away. Sablevein turned to Lyra. Do you wish to return now? He asked softly. Lyra's chest tightened with longing so fierce it hurt. Yes, she whispered. Please. He extended his hand. She took it. The journey back was not the same as the descent. The river moved with them now, not strained but eager, currents lifting and carrying them upward like a current that wanted its story finished where it began. The stone corridors seemed brighter, the moss less brittle. Fish darted with renewed energy. The lily garden they passed again lifted its petals as if waking from sleep. When they approached the millstream's bend, Lyra felt sunlight filtering through water above. The surface shimmered. They rose. Air struck Lyra's face, crisp and sweet. She coughed out a laugh that sounded half like sobbing. Water streamed from her hair and sleeves. The river beside the mill house was no longer a sheet of glass. It ran, swift and lively, curling around stones, whispering against the bank. The mill wheel turned with a steady creak creak creak, its paddles catching the current as if they had never stopped. Lyra stood on the bank and stared, breath coming too fast, heart too full. The millhouse door burst open. Edda stumbled out, his hair wild, his shirt half-buttoned, flour dust streaking his forearms. He froze when he saw Lyra, as if his eyes could not trust the shape of her. Then he crossed the yard in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms so hard she nearly lost her balance. You're wet as a drowned rat, he said hoarsely, and the attempt at humor broke on the edges of something deeper. Lyra clung to him, burying her face against his shoulder. I'm here, she whispered. I'm here. The river's back. Edda's shoulders shook once. He held her tighter, then slowly eased back and cupped her face with trembling hands, studying her as if to make sure she was real. His gaze flicked to Sablevein, standing a few steps away by the riverbank, water streaming off him like moving silk, his eyes deep as ever but steadier now in the sunlit world. Edda drew in a careful breath. River King, he said, voice respectful, wary. Thank you. Sablevein inclined his head. You kept faith, he replied. Your daughter carried it. Edda's eyes returned to Lyra's throat, where the token's faint embossing was barely visible. Then his gaze dropped to her hand, where the pearl ring gleamed softly. His mouth tightened. What did it cost you? He asked quietly. Lyra swallowed. She looked at the river. At the turning wheel. At her father's hands. At the valley beyond, still green but with a dryness in its wind that would fade slowly now. Then she looked at Sablevein. It cost me fear, she said softly. And it gave me duty. She took Edda's hands in hers. But I'm still your daughter. I'm still here. And I can keep the mill and the river together now, properly. So no one can do this again. Edda's eyes shone. He nodded once, as if that was the only way he could bear it. The day unfolded like a thaw. Neighbors arrived, drawn by the sound of the wheel turning again. People crowded the bank, murmuring, pointing at the river as if it were a miracle that had chosen to appear in their ordinary world. Some crossed themselves. Some laughed. Some cried. Lyra worked among them with wet hair and steady hands, explaining what she could without turning the truth into spectacle, that the marker stones must be repaired, that water must be shared, that the river's old agreements were not superstition but survival. When she spoke, the river seemed to listen. Small ripples curled near her ankles, gentle and approving. And when she looked up, Sablevein stood at the edge of the current, half in water and half out, as if learning the shape of ordinary days. That evening, as sunlight softened into amber and the valley's shadows lengthened, Lyra walked down to the river alone. The air smelled of wet grass and flower dust and the first honest promise of relief. Sablevein rose from the water near her without drama, as if he had always belonged there. You came, she said. I will come, he replied, quiet. Not only when the river is threatened. Lyra's throat token pulsed warm. She reached out, hesitated for a heartbeat, then took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, firm, careful, real. What happens now? She asked. Sablevein's gaze drifted over the valley. Now, he said, we keep peace by keeping flow. We repair what was broken. We watch for greed. And we let the river be generous again. Liora swallowed, her chest tight with the weight of it and the rightness too. And us? She asked softly. Sablevein's eyes met hers, deep and steady. Us, he said, and the word sounded like a vow that had already taken root. You are my anchor. I am your river. We will learn how to be both without harm. Lyra's lips curved, small and shaky. I can learn, she whispered. So can I, he said. The river whispered around their joined hands, flowing smooth and clear. Above them, the first evening star appeared. And below it, the mill wheel turned on, steady, faithful, while the river ran with a peace that did not require fear to hold.